Welcome to Watchtower History. So now let's look more at the Watchtower conspiracy about the Rothschilds, because they went deep into that one. So in Vindication, Rutherford publishes letters from the Rothschilds' brother bankers. And these letters about this world conspiracy, this Jewish world conspiracy. So we're going to try and fact check and see if we can find these letters and verify their validity. On newspaper.com, I did a search trying to find these letters and trying to find the origin or the source of these letters. I was having a hard time finding them. I could find them only in the 1890s, and then they start getting repeated again in the 1930s. And notice the location of all of these. Notice they're all the Kansas City Sun. There's some Missouri newspapers. There's one in Louisiana. They're only in the South. And then they're not repeated again after that. So that got me thinking, well, why are they only in certain areas? Why only at a certain time? Why aren't they repeated later? Why are they ignored for decades and not appearing again until later on? So I got to searching. I got to investigating. We'll get to that in a little bit because this is very, very important. So again, there's this conspiracy about the Rothschilds and the banking families. There's a lot of stories about the Rothschilds. When you start looking at the history, you start trying to fact check them, they don't seem to check out. And the stories are always changing.
And I'd like to add that the people who are repeating the stories are just repeating what somebody else said as fact without a fact check upon that. So now you have people just, oh, this is a fact now. The Rothschilds are doing this. This person's doing that. And that's how these things get spread and continue going. So when you go back, like we did, mostly Jeff, go back looking into this to find the actual documentation, it's just not there.
So as stated already, we were unable to find these letters that are in Rutherford's book Vindication anywhere in any writings previous to the 1890s. And in the 1890s, it's only in the Populist newspapers of the time period, and mainly in the South, in Missouri, in Kansas, Louisiana. Here you can see the headline in this Populist newspaper that says, "Afraid of the white vote." And so they're talking segregation here. They're talking the white power and white supremacy. This was a popular theme in the populist movement, especially in the South. Remember, they're just coming out of that Reconstruction period. They're just coming out of the Civil War, just a couple decades previous to that. And they're still holding on to the principles of keeping separate and distinct. Now remember, Rutherford was a populist. He campaigned for William Jennings Bryan and the Populist Party in his early pre-Watchtower days. But there's more interesting things that we found about this. And so remember, these alleged words of Nathan Rothschild, Rutherford says in Vindication that it comes from a book or a newspaper called Vox Populi. We're unable to find this newspaper or magazine. It is in the Barton Beacon from Great Bend, Kansas, on June 21st, 1894, and several other papers. But again, just in this limited area and only populist newspapers. So again, the question we like to ask is why? So the Rothschild's letter in Vindication says, Mr. John Sherman has written to us from a town in Ohio, USA, as to the profits that may be made in the national banking business under a recent act of your Congress, a copy of which act accompanied this letter. Right? And so they're linking in this Mr. Sherman with some kind of conspiracy about the silver trade. And so this came up at an 1896 congressional meeting. And so there's this debate about Sherman. The congressional record is the opposite of what these Rothschild letters claim. Sherman's opinions were the opposite of what's claimed for him in these letters. And one of the things that the Sherman antitrust laws did was to target monopolies, exactly the opposite of what the later claims of Sherman and the Rothschilds ended up being. Section 2 of the Sherman antitrust law reads, every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor, and on conviction thereof shall be punished by fine not exceeding $5,000, which was a lot at the time, or by imprisonment not exceeding 1 year, or by both said punishments in the discretion of the court. Now, this firm that's listed at the bottom of the letter, that's at 3 Wall Street, that doesn't appear anywhere either. Not in a newspaper record, not in any city directories. There's no court cases. These 3 names don't even appear together outside of these supposed and alleged letters. So why is Rutherford quoting these Rothschild letters? So remember, in his historical sketch that we gave earlier, we mentioned his political background. And we mentioned that he had campaigned for William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was one of the supporters of this idea of free silver. There was this change of the gold standard and the silver standard back at the late of the 19th century. And some thought that this would be the end of civilization as we know it. As we said, Rutherford campaigned for William Jennings Bryan before he joined the Watchtower, and he brought some of those ideas from the Populist Party with him right up into his presidency and made it a part of the Watchtower doctrine. You'll see even in The Day of Vengeance, Russell's 4th book, that there's something mentioned about this, that the yellow man with the white money. And so he repeats a conspiracy theory about this silver trade.
But for many Protestants, this new interpretation of the Bible threatened the nation's special relationship with God. Evangelical America would fight back. William Jennings Bryan, a 2-term congressman from Nebraska, believed that Protestant religion must be returned to the center of American life.
I would rather speak on religion than on politics. I make no apology for speaking upon a religious theme, for it is the most universal of themes.
Bryan is the most radical Christian politician of the late 19th century. I don't think anybody else, even up to our own time, has used the Bible and the kind of morality that he saw in the Bible as a basis for governing.
Bryan hearkened back to a different America, the mostly rural America of his Illinois youth.
In religious terms, he was evangelical, and his theology was pretty conservative. He did believe that the Bible was literal truth.
Bryan was an unabashed believer in the authority of the Bible. God acted in history, and God had a purpose in history, that America had a purpose in history, and it was to be God's instrument.
Bryan looked on in despair at what was happening to his country.
Well, William Jennings Bryan was one of the great men of the period. William Jennings Bryan was one of those who kept the people informed on what was going on and who was always in line for the welfare of the people. Now, I heard him one time in Kansas City by accident at a noonday meeting. He happened to come up to that meeting, and he made a short speech in which he said that he had attended the first Democratic convention in his career in 1876 at Philadelphia. And he said they had to poke me into a window so I could get in. And he said, you know, they've been trying to put me out over the transom ever since. And then I was present in Convention Hall when he made one of his great Convention Hall in Kansas City, when he made one of his great speeches. And I was way up in the top of the thing in the great old Convention Hall, which finally burned down. And when he came out on the stage, he didn't look higher than a youngster 2 feet high. But when he started to speak, there was not a sound in the hall. And you could hear him all over the place. And he delivered one of his great lectures there on why it was necessary for the country to remain in the Democratic column, because the Democrats were for the people and the opposition party was not. And then I saw him on several occasions, one time here in Independence, when he was here on a Chautauqua lecture, which he delivered his great lecture on the Prince of Peace, one of the greatest I ever heard. And of course, I was a little prejudiced, being a Democrat, but William Jennings Bryan is one of the few men of that period who kept the liberal program going to the present day. And of course, I'm a little prejudiced and a great admirer of his, but he was one of the great men of his period.
By the 1890s, millions of Americans had migrated from farms and small towns to teeming cities.
The pace of work is different. The organization is going to be much more bureaucratic, much more impersonal. That sense of community isn't going to exist there.
Between 1880 and 1900, nearly 10 million immigrants arrived in the United States.
Even the workers themselves are going to be different. They're not going to be of the same religious background, the same ethnic background.
Slums began to overflow. By the turn of the century, 1 in 8 Americans lived in poverty.
Evangelical Protestants could look out and see a world that was rapidly changing that needed explanation. There was a great introspection, and one could even say a kind of self-doubt that was emerging. Are they losing their dominance, their place in what they thought was their special charge? This chosen nation, this Redeemer nation.
And William Jennings Bryan would lead the fight to restore America as a nation with a special relationship to God. A politician from Nebraska is channeling the public's frustrations.
I will tear down those trusts.
And directing them right at America's richest men.
Do you hear me, Carnegie? Do you hear me, Rockefeller?
William Jennings Bryan is an up-and-coming political force who's drawing huge crowds, vowing to put an end to the country's monopolies. But Bryan's promise of change is bad news for the leaders of American business.
To many people, it seemed as though big money, big corporations, and the biggest of all, Standard Oil, were taking over the country. From this emerged the progressive movement, and a major part of its platform was antitrust legislation. Not just legislation, but antitrust prosecution.
Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan have built entire industries from the ground up. They're not about to let a charismatic politician destroy their empires. In 1896, Bryan became the Democratic Party's candidate for president. Crisscrossing the country, he campaigned furiously, accusing bankers and industrialists of controlling the government for their own interests, advocating for the farmer, the miner, the common man.
His faith shaped the way he viewed policy. You lift up the weak. You take care of the oppressed. You cherish the poor.
Bryan lost the election, but gained a national reputation. He became a professional speaker, drawing huge crowds of adoring fans wherever he went.
He was often compared to a good preacher, using metaphors from the Bible, quoting directly from the King James Bible, and wove those lines into political messages. He had a really loyal following among evangelical Protestants who saw him very much as their standard bearer, bringing to politics a much more Christian outlook.
Bryan's message struck a chord with a growing number of Americans unhappy with the direction their country was headed. To some, the situation was so grave that the apocalypse, as described in the book of Revelation, seemed close at hand.
There's a number of Protestants who are thinking that America's covenant relationship with God is in peril. We're not progressing towards some Christian perfected state, that we're regressing, and that God will have to intervene.
This is William Jennings Bryan at a recent Democrat rally. He's a prohibitionist and a devout Presbyterian. According to him, Darwin's theory of evolution is a pack of lies. He's an enemy of the gold standard and an enemy of big business. It is certain that he will win the Democratic nomination. What do you think?
The Republican Party has a good candidate.
No. We have to buy our own president.
They took advantage of the strengths. When you have, what relatively speaking is an unlimited amount of money, you can pay people to do almost anything for you.
Desperate to protect the empires they've spent their lifetimes building, the Titans throw their full support behind the candidacy of Ohio Governor William McKinley.
Democrats convened in Chicago in the summer of 1896 to pick their nominee for the upcoming presidential election. There were 6 serious contenders and no clear frontrunner. Neither was there a definite consensus on an issue that had become increasingly contentious: the future of the nation's currency. Some Democrats supported the gold standard, which aligned them with big business. Others were determined to introduce silver, which they believed would help out struggling farmers and working people.
The silver wing of the party has this continuing complaint against Cleveland and the gold Democrats, complaining that Cleveland sold the United States to J.P. Morgan. And those people who criticized Morgan said, this is one more example of what this nation has come to, where one individual can hold the entire nation hostage to his willingness to cut this deal or not. This is untenable. Something has to change.
Making the case for silver fell to a little-known former congressman from Nebraska, 36-year-old William Jennings Bryan.
He has practiced relentlessly to make sure his voice could be heard as far as possible. He can project his voice so well and modulate it so well that it's quite possible that he was the only speaker in that debate that everyone in the hall could hear.
Having behind us the laboring interests and all the toiling masses, Bryan thundered to the 15,000 conventioneers. We will answer demands for a gold standard by saying, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
He thrusts out his arms. Are we going to crucify America on a cross of gold? And he stands there then in the pause and the silence as he himself becomes this epitome of the United States, of workers, of everybody, as being the crucified Christ in this great evangelical Protestant appeal, and the audience just erupts.
It's so powerful because it does sum up what people have been feeling for now probably 2 generations, certainly all through the Gilded Age, that the country seemed to many to have lost its soul, that all that mattered was enrichment, the gathering in of as much money and wealth as possible, and that this was the election. This was going to be a turning point.
Bryan's speech won the Hall and secured him the Democratic nomination. He advocated something entirely new for a major national party. Bryan Democrats supported silver, a federal income tax on the highest earners, and the breakup of powerful industrial monopolies.
For the 19th century, the Democrats had been really the party of smaller government and more local authority. And all of a sudden they're saying, you know what? In this era of corporate capitalism, we need government to do more to play a role in protecting and advancing the interests of ordinary people who are facing forces that are much bigger and more powerful than they have in the past.
The Holy Republic, increasing in population, in wealth, in strength, and in influence, solving the problems of civilization, and hastening the coming of a universal brotherhood. A republic which shakes thrones and dissolves aristocracies by its silent example and gives light and inspiration to those who sit in darkness. Behold a republic, gradually but surely becoming the supreme moral factor in the world's progress and the accepted arbiter of the world's disputes. A republic whose history, like the path of the just, is as the shining light that shineth more and more unto the perfect day.
Remember, in the 1890s, Rutherford's wife ended up with the studies in the scriptures of Charles Taze Russell. But he took years to research it. He wasn't convinced right away. It wasn't until 1905, at least a decade later. And he said he tried to check out everything. Remember, Rutherford's campaigning for William Jennings Bryan, who was involved in the silver gold standard conspiracy. That was his platform. When Rutherford's looking at these volumes of Russell, he sees these ideas in there, or some of these ideas. I wonder if that was one of the catalysts to say, oh, at that time when Rutherford came in 1905, William Jennings Bryan is no longer as popular as he had been. He's not really campaigning any longer. I wonder if Rutherford really thought that Russell was the chosen one because of these theories that he had been pursuing with Bryan for at least a decade previous. Rutherford thought that Bryan was the chosen one to solve the world's problems, and he had to reevaluate that after Bryan's losses as a presidential candidate.
That's possible, but for the record, in defense of Russell, he briefly mentioned it, and it wasn't the focal point of his movement. His was a religious movement, not based on political. He would just point to world events and stuff like that. The silver that he mentioned, that silver standard changing gold to silver, was briefly mentioned, which does show though that Rutherford really did read the books.
All right, so he's not building a whole religion out of the various theories from the silver trade. Rutherford does try to do that through these Rothschild letters, by the way,
which we'll go into more detail in a minute.
So Williams Jennings Bryan. And so you can see there's an article here. Free silver means free men. The argument graphically stated by Moreton Freeman. And so there were a lot of newspaper articles at the time. And you'll see this is one of the debates that's going on between William Jennings Bryan and McKinley in the St. Louis Dispatch from July 26, 1896.
Again, back
this is
to
the main campaign platform.
A main location, back to what Jeff was saying earlier. there was a whole section of where all those newspapers were congregating in the same idea. Go ahead, Jeff. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think that'll explain where you're going with this better.
Now, remember, Rutherford campaigned for Bryan for years. William Jennings Bryan is quoted by Rutherford, the Golden Age, the Watchtower, quite often. The Golden Age of August 27th, 1924, talks about the Democratic Convention and William Jennings Bryan. And it says, it's got some interesting things in here. The convention differed materially from the hard-boiled, made-to-order routine of the Cleveland Convention of the Republicans. Life was interjected into the convention by the Ku Klux Klan and the League of Nations issues. The platform makes an effort to face the troubles the United States is up against. It reads well, and if it could be lived up and enforced without friction, no doubt it would bring some relief. But we must remember that before any good thing can become lawful, it must go through the red tape labyrinths of blows, amendments, and resolutions, so on and so forth. So down a little bit further on, it says, the Klan plank lost by the narrow margin of 4.35 votes, the credit being partly due to the appeal of the Democratic warhorse, Williams Jennings Bryan. The radio announcer said that in the beginning of his talk, Mr. Bryan received a lot of booze. Not booze, alcohol, I think booze, but I think they spelled it incorrectly. This sounded extremely strange of the man with the grape juice reputation. He was opposed to alcohol, right? But the announcer was spelling his booze with an S instead of a Z. The margin of 4.35 votes leaves it possible for the Democratic Party to maintain its solidarity, at least for the present. They mention even the platform of William Jennings Bryan when they're supposedly trying to be neutral in politics during the 1920s. Very, very interesting.
Eat grapefruit and oatmeal. Bada bing. Beer. My God, this guy.
But remember that Bryan was opposed to alcohol. When he was Secretary of State for President Wilson, he refused to give any alcohol to any of the foreign dignitaries that visited the United States. It was traditional, of course, to have wine. He gave them grape juice instead. But of course, in 1913 and 1914, when he did this, it was a great big boost to Welch's grape juice. That's one of the ways that they became popular because of what Bryan did. And so you can see Macmillan's very, very much for prohibition. And so was Rutherford in his early career. He was for prohibition. It was later on when Rutherford changed, when he tried to find excuses to drink alcohol, just like you see here. And of course, they were smuggling in alcohol from Canada, per that statement from Walter Salter.
So that's what I was just going to say. So what Bryan did for Welch's, Rutherford did for Canadian whiskey. you gotta laugh at the irony of all this.
Similarly, we have this article here from Macmillan, and Macmillan is talking about what happened with Bryan, and this is with Bryan and the grape juice, and this is back in 1913, of course. Macmillan says, the whole world has reverberated with public comment concerning our Secretary of State Bryan's banquet in honor of the retiring British ambassador, Honorary James Bryce. The unusual custom of serving wine was laid aside, and Mr. Bryan, true to his temperance convictions, served grape juice instead. While some have scoffed and others have considered our country insulted and disgraced, nevertheless, this act will go down in history to the credit of one who, in the face of worldwide ridicule, was not afraid to stand by his convictions. Would that America had more such noble statesmen at the head of her affairs. Our land would soon be free from these terrible curses due to licensed liquor and immorality. The land of liberty would cease to be an idle dream. It would become a reality. Rutherford says, the spring of 1925 will mark the beginning of the millennial era of peace. According to the Judge J.F. Rutherford, president of the International Bible Students Association, Rutherford said, if you are alive in 1925 and ever die, it will be your own fault. The offer to live forever is made to you, and you need not die unless you repudiate it. This immortality will be accomplished through the finding of the perfect food. The Lord will reveal the perfect food within the next 4 years. That's quite a prediction. He will show man that when he eats grapefruit and oatmeal together, these two ferment and make beer in his stomach in 3 minutes. And the article ends, it will be the end of the world, which means the end of our civilization, but not the end of the earth. This earth will never be destroyed, but will go on forever. And even the desert places will be as beautiful as Prospect Park in spring. The August 18th, 1925 New Era Enterprise has a front page article about William Jennings Bryan passing away. Rutherford, in the December 31st, 1915 St. Paul Enterprise, in his How Will Militarism Be Forever Destroyed? Remember that militarism article was very similar to Ford's militarism article? Rutherford says, all can readily see how this prophecy has been fulfilled and is now in process of fulfillment. All the nations that claim to be Christian nations have been fulfilling this prophecy for several years, and this and other scriptures clearly prove that before the trouble has ended, all of the so-called Christian nations of the earth will be involved. For this reason, we state that there is no earthly power that can now prevent the United States from being involved in the great and final conflict. Mr. Bryan and others, seeing that preparedness for war means war, are diligently working to prevent preparedness. And so again, he's mentioning William Jennings Bryan's opposition to war and Ford. Remember, in the Miller County Autogram for August 16, 1894, when the Democrats and the Populist ticket are talking about merging, notice the prosecuting attorney there for the Democratic ticket was J.F. Rutherford. And it was after this that Rutherford really started campaigning heavily for Bryan. Bryan was his hero. According to that Times Magazine article, that's why Rutherford continued to dress like him decades later when that was no longer the style. So Rutherford writes a letter to the Enterprise on the April 11th, 1916 issue. And he says, recently my attention was called to the fact that you expect to republish a lecture delivered by me, Why the Nation's War. I have just read the first publication. Will you kindly permit me to call to your attention one or two things which would be well to correct? The error may have been in the copy. These are my points. I don't think Rutherford liked the Enterprise, by the way. But on page 3, he says, on the second column, under the subject title, The Socialist Scheme, a sentence there now reads, they would divide all the wealth of the land among the people. It should be changed and be made to read, they would make an equal distribution of all the wealth of the land among all the people, destroy the trusts and false church systems, and create and operate a government according to their own peculiar ideas. This is that conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
In 1916.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very similar to what Ford is saying in 1915 and 16, and even more so when Ford gets to it in the 1920s. Very similar to the Populist Party conspiracies about the same thing.
Which we'll get into in a little bit.
Yeah. And so the scheme of the rich is another one. The rich say, we have a most benefit scheme of our own. Money is power. We will corner all the purchasing power of the earth. We will control the governments. And since the governments control the clergy, we will control all. We will become the benefactors of mankind and run the world to suit ourselves. To accomplish this, we must have great trusts and combinations of capital. The preachers and the politicians look to us for their money, and they must be with us as to the common people. For it is their own good that we take over their earnings, hence we will control them in whatsoever manner seems best to us. And so Rutherford's really into these conspiracies. He's trying to use this fear tactic to try and convince people that the Watchtower theology was correct. And this is just the beginning of where he's headed.
And it didn't take long for him to do that.
Yeah.
And when you put it in perspective. So
when you start looking at Rutherford's writings back in the day, you start seeing this pattern again. So if you look at the June 19th, 1917 Enterprise, there's a lecture by Rutherford, World Came to an End in 1914. And there he says, of course, there are exceptions to the rule, and there are some good, honest clergymen in the world, but alas, the majority of them, we fear, belong to the other class. The scriptures point out that both the kings and the clergy are responsible for this war, but that the clergy are even more reprehensible. So he's trying to blame some kind of religious group, right? And he's including the Catholics there too, because it was their duty to know God's plan and tell it to the people, but they have refused to learn it and failed to tell it to the others. That's what he builds his whole religion out of a decade later. We talked about that early on as well. Concerning the responsibility for this war, Rabbi Wise of New York recently said, so he says the clergy is responsible, and then he quotes a rabbi. He's linking the Jews in as the responsibility of the war, which Henry Ford said the Jews were responsible for the World War. The failure of the churches and synagogues to maintain leadership over the people was the cause of the present war. They have enthroned a war devil in place of God. They are satisfied to a mere item, a social organization, and defend their countries and rulers, just or unjust. Reverend Dr. Peter, pastor of the Christian Temple, said, more than to any other source, the cause of the great war lies at the door of the church. So he's blaming both Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish as the cause of the war. March 28th, 1918, Enterprise. New dispensation here, affirms Rutherford. Again, Jesus stated that revolution would follow the war at the end of the world. Already the revolution has afflicted Russia, and the Bolsheviks threaten to carry the fight into all the earth. Germany will not be conquered by the British, American, or other allied armies, because before that she can be accomplished in internal disruptions will destroy the German autocracy, and then according to Mr. Wilson, there'd be no occasion to fight the German people. All right, so a little bit further down, the former American ambassador to Germany recently in an interview said a revolution is certain to follow in Germany. If they do rise, because of their greater brutality, their greater beastliness, which exceeds that of any other people on earth, they will make the French Revolution look like a picnic. That's an interesting statement, knowing what we know. As a class, according to the scriptures, the clergymen are the most reprehensible men on earth for the great war that is now inflicting mankind. All right, so the next quote down below. The clergy aided the kings. Ambitious kings of Europe armed for war because they desired to grab the territory of the other people, and the clergy patted them on the back. Go to it, you can do no wrong, whatever you do is right. The 17th and 18th chapters of Revelation give a vivid depiction of the mixing of politics and religion. All right, so he's mixing in the clergy, the Bolsheviks, the World War, and all of these things into his new beastly picture that he's trying to develop. This is the beginning of that. That's where he's headed. A Godly Hero, the life of William Jennings Bryan. Back to the silver trade. The repeal of the Silver Purchase Act improved neither their American economy nor Cleveland's political standing. Remember the name of Rutherford's son, Malcolm Cleveland Rutherford, was named after President Cleveland. Unemployment and business failures only increased as investors hurried to exchange their silver certificates for gold coins. Then in the summer of 1894, the president sent 2,000 troops and 5,000 federal marshals to break a national railroad strike that had begun as a conflict between the makers of the Pullman sleeping cars and their autocratic employer. So you go down a little bit further. J.P. Morgan and a handful of other Wall Street bankers were to shed some of their excess bullion for $50 million in government bonds. This was a logical act, giving Cleveland's fealty to gold, but it further inflamed populists and rebel Democrats who already suspected the president of being a lackey of the money power. And so the Populist Party is already talking about a conspiracy to control the finances. And so Rutherford's schooled in these financial conspiracies from even before he becomes a Bible student. Williams, Jennings, Bryan.
This is the important part right here where we're getting at. Everything is building up for this to Bryan, to Rutherford. So the track has been laid. Now continue, Jeff.
So Williams, Jennings, Bryan is one of the strongest proponents of this. The Populist movement was one of the strongest proponents of this. And so when you start looking at the Populist Party,
which is the connection between Bryan and Rutherford, two populists,
and we look at Bryan. So early the next spring, he made his own intentions clear. In Florida's Democratic primary, Bryan was easily elected a delegate at large on the promise he would only support a nominee who was both progressive and dry. They were pushing the prohibition stance. If you remember Rutherford's early view on prohibition, he had agreed with Bryan on that.
Until he started drinking.
And then he disagreed, right?
Well, he agreed with it. He ignored, not to be too critical, but he ignored the prohibition anyway. He just had his imported from Canada. He didn't even buy American-made rye.
And so Williams, Jennings, Bryan had started a newspaper called The Commoner, but that ceased publication. But he was still publishing these weekly Bible talks as an acceptable substitute to try and get his opinions out there. That's what Williams, Jennings, Bryan was doing. And the firm that syndicated the talks also hired him to write about the Democratic Convention, in which he hoped to play a leading role. He was still hoping to lead the Democratic Party. But for all his lifelong optimism, Bryan was helpless to understand, much less solve, the internal crisis of his party. From his more strident Protestant followers, he heard calls to deport foreign bootleggers and pleas to vanquish the Tammany-led gang who wrecked the Democrats in the last campaign. Few mentioned the KKK, but neither did they condemn it. This also sounds like Watchtower. It was mentioned a few times, but they didn't really condemn it. Very, very similar again. Unlike the scattering of Catholics who wrote to him asking for help. William Giggs Magatto was eager to inherit Bryan's evangelical base in the South and West, but the faithful were suspicious of the slick attorney who was Wilson's son-in-law and had played a minor role in the Teapot Dome. Bryan endorsed no one, which inevitably stirred rumors that he hoped to be nominated himself. All right, go down a little bit more. The metropolises of the 1920s were becoming a thrilling places to live. Broadcasts of blues, jazz, and polka music, packed ethnic theaters, and prosperous immigrant banks all signaled that a new culture dominated by white Catholics, Jews, and African Americans had come of age. Such Democratic kingpins as Charles Murphy from Tammany Hall and George Brennan in Chicago eagerly defended their working-class constituents against their self-righteous enemies. Whether nativists in Congress, the KKK, or dries who cringed to think of anyone buying a shot of bourbon or a stein of lager. You can see some of the similarities in what Rutherford's doing in the early 1920s, which after Bryan died, he had switched. He started drinking again. So you had this problem in the Populist Party of racism towards the blacks in some areas, racism toward the Jews and other areas, and they're trying to cater to all of them, and they can't seem to keep a cohesion together, and that's why they kept losing. That's why they kept failing. So Rutherford campaigned for them for years, but they weren't winning, and he had to find another avenue, and that's when he joined the Bible student movement, and then his path went forward from there. But he, as we can see, even during the Russell period, Rutherford is still bringing some of those populist ideas with him in his lectures, in the teachings that he's doing.
And it wasn't just Rutherford bringing in. It was Hartshorne. There were other writers. Bonet made a few contributions. There were other people in the I say late Russell Watchtower period, that were starting to emerge with these ideas too. And it's amazing. I'm kind of surprised they all didn't get along better and create a mega church. But I guess fighting amongst themselves, they it was a power struggle. Who was going to run it in many cases. So it wasn't just Rutherford with these ideas. There were more than one.
Thank you. Penton in his book mentions this, but he didn't take it far enough. He says, probably as a result of these early experiences and a commitment to the populist ideals of William Jennings Bryan, he developed a strong personality and outspoken, although seldom manifested sympathy for the downtrodden, and a thoroughgoing contempt for big business, politicians, and later the clergy. What Penton didn't realize is the anti-Semitism that was in the populist movement. We're going to go a little bit more into that and show and prove this. We're going to show the documentation for that.
And again, Penton noticed it. Others have noticed it and tied it to the populist movement. But like Jess said, we are going to take it one step further.
But when we talked to Penton about this, again, Penton didn't realize how far this went. So when we showed Penton that it went a lot further than even he had suggested, again, this is another one of those things that he said he was thunderstruck by.
Wow, look at this. This is tremendous. This is outstanding because it shows Rutherford's background, and it's also touching a number of other people. I am thunderstruck by some of the things you're telling me. But when you point these things out, it makes the best sense in the world. This is such a powerful thing because it deals with the Watchtower Society, not only him, but others with him, and the connection to Henry Ford, who was terribly anti-Semitic. I am just very, very enthused about this because this is just the sort of historical research that I love to see coming out.
It just really blew him away. He had not realized all of these connections to the origins of this anti-Semitic rhetoric that Watchtower was pushing at the time.
And thereby creating a new religion.
Yeah. In 1915, if you remember, there were the Rutherford-Troy debates. If you saw our Judge Rutherford death threat discussion, where we track Rutherford's whereabouts in the 1915-1916 period, in 1915, Rutherford's at the World's Fair in California. It's interesting that William Jennings Bryan is at the World's Fair in California as well. So one day I got to thinking, were they there at the same time? So I started to check. In the Oakland Tribune, March 21st, 1915, says Wilson may speak at Patriots' Day. It is hoped that President Wilson or Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan will make the principal address. All right, and so they're stating that would happen around April 19th on Patriots' Day. This was the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Where was Rutherford? Here's another article. This is a South San Francisco Journal. Greatest celebration in the history of the West at the Panama Pacific International Exposition, April 17th and 18th. Again, William Jennings Bryan scheduled to speak. Where was Rutherford at that time? The Bible students had a booth there, what they were using for witnessing. And different ones would be scheduled to work there at different times, or they could choose to be there. Rutherford was there March 26th to April 30th, 1915. And he's at the same location. You can see the picture of him and his wife there. Rutherford and Bryan are there at the same exact time. Whether or not they met there, we don't know. But if Rutherford had campaigned with him for
they knew
years,
each other. Yeah,
they knew each other. I'm wondering if he went to go see his old friend. We do know that Rutherford and Bryan were both at the 1924 Democratic National Convention and that they spoke together. We have evidence for that. So stay tuned. We'll bring up that story in a little while. Now, with that said, think about those lectures that we just saw of Rutherford during the 1915 and 1916 period, where Rutherford's bringing in these populist ideas. Bryan was a populist. Rutherford was still holding these populist ideas from his campaigning from decades previous. We're going to get into more of evidence for that here in a moment. All right, so now we're back to the Rothschild letters. One of the clues given in Vindication also helped us track this down. And I'm going to quote from page 171. There is still living at this time in the state of New York a man upward of 85 years of age who had plates made reproducing these letters as they appeared in the publication above mentioned. We'll get to that in a second. He used these letters against the money changers during the Populist movement. Here's our Populist movement in the United States. So here's the claim that Rutherford's making. Letters passed between the Rothschild bankers of London, two of which letters, together with a circular appearing with them and which relate to the National Banking Act, are published below. More than 30 years ago, a St. Louis magazine published these letters, and their authenticity has never been disproved. All right, so what Rutherford's saying is that these letters originated in the Populist movement, and they were found in a St. Louis newspaper from 30 years ago.
And they have not been disproven.
Okay. All right. Where was Rutherford 30 years ago?
St. Louis.
That's a really good guess. How did you know that? What political party was he a member of?
The Populist.
So Rutherford saved these letters for 30 years.
But never showed anyone.
All right. So now he publishes it in this 1932 book. So now when we go and look at our search results for where did these letters appear previously, they only appeared 30 years before. And when you start looking at these newspapers, you realize these are all populist newspapers. And the populist newspapers love the Rothschilds' conspiracies. There's a lot of political cartoons about the Rothschilds' conspiracies in those populist papers. So a lot of racist and anti-Semitic artwork, all illustrating this conspiracy. You can see over here, there's a cross that's labeled gold. And it's got the Rothschilds there at the bottom. This was a lecture called The Cross of Gold by Jennings Bryan. So now looking at the newspaper record, now I know when to look. I know what to look at. Then I start looking for these letters back and trying to prove their validity. And Rutherford says these letters have never been disproven. Is that true? And so what you find...
My first question before you go there. First of all, have they ever been proven?
Good question.
Because just because something hasn't been disproven does not mean it's automatically proven.
Okay. All right. So when you look at the newspaper record and you start looking at the Populist Party, you start to find there are lots of conspiracy letters, lots of Rothschild letters, lots of banking conspiracies, lots of silver trade, all sorts of things, all originating from the Populist Party. In one town like St. Joseph, Missouri, and again, this is Rutherford's area, you'll see these letters be published in one side of town in one of the newspapers. On the other side of town, you'll see the other newspaper calling them out, stating it's a forgery. And they're basically saying, you said this was in the London Times of this date, And when we have that copy of that paper and it's not in there. And so you should retract your statement because it's not true. It would always be ignored. And so they were very commonly publishing all sorts of these letters. And so you'll see some of these titles of these articles still going the rounds. The Grip of Gold, the Financial News Forgery. Here's a statement here. The St. Joseph Gazette puts in a frame today on its editorial page the refutation of a lie about Mr. Bryan. Now will the Gazette take the trouble to read the London Financial News, which is pasted on the window at the McKinley headquarters, which denounces the Grip of Gold published by the Gazette as a forgery? And will the Gazette drop into the German-American Bank and read the proceedings of the Bankers National Association, the proof that the Bankers Circular, also published by the Gazette, was a forgery? And will the Gazette publish in its frame these evidences that it has been lying in the service of Bryan? William Jennings Bryan kept publishing these forgeries. And even when they would try and say, well, it came from this paper or this date or this or that, could never be verified. It was always incorrect. Another one, a glaring infamy, the Financial News Forgery, a base forgery, financial forgeries, forged documents. They are constantly appearing in populist papers. They're being called out for it. The Grip of Gold, again calling out Bryan. The Free Silver papers, including the St. Joseph Gazette, continue to try to support that Grip of Gold forgery by all sorts of schemes. The latest are professed affidavits. Why don't somebody produce a copy of the London Financial News containing the article? Nothing else will settle it. In the face of the copy of that paper in the windows of the McKinley headquarters on Felix Street, which pronounces it a forgery. Of course, the St. Joseph Gazette has not copied the Post-Dispatch's confession that the Bankers Circular is a fraud, and our higher critic has not yet heard in regard to it. The Post-Dispatch did the honest and honorable thing in putting their confession of error in a frame as large as they used for the forgery. So there were some of those that admitted that it was a forgery when they were called out on it. More forgery and fraud. Another one, Grip of Gold fake. Here's an example, the American Bimetallist. That's that silver-gold conspiracy. This is a popular paper. Notice in the lower left corner, Hope and Bryan. They were pushing William Jennings Bryan. And in this November 5th, 1897 paper are these two forgeries, these two letters about John Sherman. The St. Joseph Daily News. Again, the Gazette's deliberate lie. So Rutherford says, in the vindication, these have never been proven to be a fraud or being proven a fake. The evidence is exactly the opposite. Maybe he was only reading the populist papers. He wasn't reading the other side in the news. So maybe that could be, because the papers that he was reading didn't admit the forgery, although there were some. So October 1st, 1898, The Nation. The Bryanites are still clinging to that London Financial News forgery, but their falsehoods about it are very clumsy. As originally put forth, the forgery purported to be an exact extract from the Financial News of March 10th, 1896, when on August 13th, that journal published an emphatic declaration that no such article has ever been printed by it, either on March 10th or at any other time. The Bryanites asserted that they would prove the genuineness of the extract, which had come to them certified by a London clipping agency by producing a copy of the paper from which it was clipped. A short time later, they announced that all their efforts to obtain a copy had been fruitless, that no new dealer has it, and the publishers announced that it is out of print. The conclusion which they drew from this state of things was, the Financial News claims a circulation of 1.5 million, which makes the sudden and complete disappearance of the issue of a certain date all the more mysterious and wonderful. The common mind immediately concludes the issue in question has been called to. We suppose that they settled the matter, but we are now in receipt of a broadside sent out from the Bryan headquarters in Denver, in which it is asserted that the Democratic headquarters has now in its possession a certified copy of the article in question. No explanation is given of the sudden change of date, because now it's a different date. But as final proof of the authenticity of the publication, it's added that Senator Teller of Colorado states more than a year ago, he was shown and read a copy of the London Financial News of April 30th, 1894, containing the identical editorial. It is not worth to chase the forgery any further. For forgers who can shift their dates 2 or 3 years without offering any explanation can be trusted not to do much among intelligent people, even though the London Financial News said even they never published it. It was a lie. The Bryanite broadside upon which we now find it gives almost an entire page to the repeatedly exposed forgery of a letter from J. Francis Forsyth, banker of number 11 Wall Street. There was no such banker in existence, and the letter is a stupid invention from beginning to end. That's the silver gold bimetal standard idea that they were suggesting. They were calling out Bryan and the Populists for these forgeries.
Now, this one strikes me the funniest of them all, the most ironic of them all. First, they're calling those people Bryanites. Okay, that tells me he's got a following. Now, the part I like is he's writing letters in here. There's two parts. One, he's writing letters. Do you think this is where Rutherford learned you can just write something and print it and worry about proving it later?
I wonder about that,
yeah. You get back down to the end of the article and where it goes back to about changing dates. So if they're going to shift their dates 2 or 3 years without offering explanation, they can't be trusted. Okay, who else is shifting dates? I mean, you look at it, it is a direct comparison when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together in the time.
Okay? And we also know what kind of lawyer he was and the kind of shady things that he was involved in based on the newspaper articles and the court records that we found. And that was during his populist movement, yeah.
And he's learned, I mean, I'm sure helping Bryan, who was a professional politician, really educated Rutherford. Hey, I could apply what I learned here in my new religion.
Yeah.
So his background, again, this enforces his background between practicing law the way he did, beginning in politics the way he did, learning from these people, and then you look at what he did to the Bible and how he just shifted and dates and create this, say that. I have undoubtedly proves I have a letter here. And again, going back to when he got out of prison, okay, that was off a few days. He just said it was another day, to make it fulfill his prophecy. So you're seeing a lot of his background in here forming the religion. And if we can't get anything else through, let it be that.
The Rothschild family began to make its fortune in the late 1700s, from 1760 in the German city of Frankfurt. Mayer Rothschild was a financier, and he was very successful in being able to actually pass on huge amounts of that wealth to 5 sons. Those sons were placed in cities around Europe, prominent places, that began a kind of banking empire. The Rothschilds were very successful. They did become very wealthy, particularly through the 19th century. And so the myth attached to them that they were therefore controlling world events. So the original source for the Rothschild conspiracy is from 1846 with a pamphlet written by a Frenchman called Georges d'Anveiling under a pseudonym called Satan. Now this conspiracy theory then began by asserting some 30 years after the event that at the Battle of Waterloo a man called Nathan Rothschild, a prominent European banker living in London, had been at the Battle of Waterloo and, knowing which way the battle was going, hired a chain of horses to rush to the Belgian coast, hired a fisherman to take him across stormy seas, more coaches to London where he could, on the stock exchange, make a killing, make a huge amount of vast fortune. Now this document, as I say, some 30 years after the event itself, is the only real source we have of this alleged conspiracy by Rothschild, and it falls apart as soon as you start looking at the actual historical record. So Nathan Rothschild wasn't at the Battle of Waterloo, there was no storm in the English Channel, he didn't make a vast killing on the stock market on that day. But this notion that Rothschild family then controlled world events is of course a myth, it's a conspiracy. And why the Rothschilds? Basically because they're Jewish. So this was written by an anti-Semite who saw the world through the lens of vast Jewish conspiracy, and the Rothschilds were a convenient or very prominent family that could be ascribed to. Jews had been blamed by their Christian neighbours in Europe for all sorts of calamities and disasters throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period. This was something which stretches back into early Christian theology, blaming Jews for the murder of Christ, when of course it was the Romans that crucified Jesus. So there's a tradition of suspicion, of hostility, of animosity towards their Jewish neighbours. In the early 20th century, originating in Tsarist Russia, a pamphlet which has become known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was published, which claimed that a small group of Jewish leaders were plotting to control the world, conspiring against the established order, and would seek to undermine traditional forms, traditional societies, and seize power for themselves. Hitler and the Nazis were very taken by this theory, as were many others. In the aftermath of the Great War, when Germany had to try to come to terms with its defeat by the Allied powers, a convenient myth became that Jews had conspired to destroy Germany from within, that they had stabbed Germany in the back. So anti-Semitism became something which the German National Socialist Party thrived upon.
Now, this Newton T. Hartshorne we've discussed before. Hartshorne, of course, is the one who was in the Civil War, the famous artist who drew the Civil War diaries and the portrait of President Grant. And he wrote several articles in the Golden Age and the Enterprise mentioning these same things. And Hartshorne also said that Henry Ford was right about the Jews. And so in searching for Hartshorne in some of the newspaper records early on, in his pre-Watchtower days, we could see that Hartshorne had these ideas even back then.
And where did he find a home to publish these ideas?
Well, of course, he was semi-famous back in the day as well for the drawing that he did of Grant and the diaries he kept in the Civil War and the artwork he did during the Civil War.
But where did he end up, and who welcomed him?
Oh, yeah, of course, he ended up as one of the writers in the Golden Age and the New Era Enterprise during the Rutherford regime.
Now, to those watching this, if you still haven't caught it by now, think about that. Who is Rutherford allowing and desiring to write for his publications? People with ideas like that. And again, no one's saying that the banking system, the financial system is righteous and going to help you out and cares for you. It's the idea of how it's being controlled and by who, and that long of thinking is where we're going.
And so Hartshorne has this article, British Rule in America. And the subheading for the article, Hartshorne writes, the United States under the control of England's Shylocks. And so he's already bringing in this idea of the Anglo-American powers, the Jews controlling the world's banking systems. This is even before Rutherford was doing it. And of course, this is the same thing that he's writing when he's writing for the Golden Age and the other Watchtower publications of the same time period.
So it leaves another question. Did Hartshorne help to fuel already lingering ideas of Rutherford, who already was prone toward that? And now that's just stoking the flame to get him going. Yes, it is true. I was right all along.
That's why he saved those papers for 30 years and published them in Vindication
And
with exactly those ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, behind the scenes, Hartshorne might have told him, hey, you should come out with them. We don't know. There's a lot of speculation. We don't know, but it is odd that two men like that would get together.
There's another one in the North Adams transcript for January 16th, 1912, where it says, GAR veterans, not vultures. And in this article, Hartshorne says, one of the heads of this power, the greatest combination of capital in the world, a combination in comparison to which Rockefeller is insignificant, said to me in England discussing American politics, quote, you do not have popular government in the United States. The people do not rule. Money rules, unquote. And of course, this is very similar to what Hartshorne was saying later on in the Enterprise and the Golden Age, decades later, in Watchtower publications themselves. He knew what he was talking about. For the agent in New York of that great London banking house was before, during, and after the Civil War, chairman of the National Committee of one of our great political parties. It was mainly the money of that banking house that paid the campaign expenses of that party. And so what he's trying to link in is, of course, this Rothschild conspiracy, without mentioning them specifically by name. He's trying to link them into the banking system of the United States and into the Civil War. And he continues, some years before the war, the Southern slaveholders expected slavery to be abolished and to be paid for their slaves. All at once, a concerted move was made secretly to embitter the South against the North. And so he's trying to link in the Rothschilds into the cause for the Civil War, which has no foundation whatsoever. He continues, more newspapers were startled with strong financial backing for the purpose of cul bono. This is a matter of history. The motto has been not so much of the British people, but of this great power, divide to conquer. And so we see as we go through Hartshorne's earlier articles, it very much mirrors the same sentiment and ideas that he was putting in the Watchtower, Golden Age, and New Era Enterprise articles decades later. There are other similar articles as well where he states the same thing. The Burlington Free Press has an article that he wrote, The British Imperial Confederation. There's another one in the North Adams transcript of January 16th, 1912, where he's suggesting the same ideas. But there's another statement here from the Hartford Courant from May 16th, 1881, where it mentions Hartshorne. And it's called Art Notes. Mr. Vorche has now on exhibition some examples of the best crayon work ever seen in the city. The artist is a Mr. Newton Hartshorne, who has been spending some years in England and on the continent. When in England, he executed from life many commissions of people of prominence, notably several members of the Rothschild family, Mr. Henry Irving, the eminent English actor, the Bishop of Chester, members of Parliament, and many of the nobility. The portrait of Lieutenant Governor Bulkeley on exhibition and that of Mr. Post are capital works, crisp and vigorous in treatment and drawing. And so here's an article suggesting that Hartshorne actually met several members of the Rothschild family. And he's bringing in these Rothschild conspiracies and said, this is what the Rothschilds told me.
Okay, now it leaves a lot of question with that. And one, the main one, why did, when he had all that information, why did he run to Watchtower to tell him? I mean, he had Grant's ear, who I'm sure if you were drew his picture, had, were that famous, popular, hey, let me talk to you. There's something interesting you might want to know, that you might want to investigate and look at. He told Rutherford. I mean, if you knew of an international conspiracy
of the Jews,
the Rothschilds, who would you tell? Rutherford? Watchtower? I mean, that's kind of a stretch there. And there's always, well, I would have told so, but they won't believe me. They'll think I'm mad. So you publish it in the Watchtower? There's a lot of people make claims, but he never presented any proof. He never went to there's no other documentation of him going anywhere in a chain of succession to newspapers. Even the newspapers, if they would have printed it, because he was famous, they would have printed it only to laugh at him and make more news. So there is no custody chain of what he's saying about the Rothschilds. No evidence. You looked, right? I've never heard. We looked.
And remember, these Rothschild conspiracies are being published in the Populist papers. And the Populist papers are being called out for those letters as complete, utter forgeries, time and time and time again. When the Populist papers said, oh, this was in the London Telegram or whatever of this date, when the newspaper on the other side of town would go and get that newspaper, it just wasn't there. There was complete, utter forgeries over and over again, as we've already shown.
Now, I'll show how things get out of line and how people believe things on their own that they say. This is a true story. It happened to me when I was younger. I was in a friend of mine's truck. I was in the line of my work, and ironically, it was a Ford. And I stopped. I saw this husband and wife. You could tell they were a little down and out. You could tell that what they had with them was probably all they had. And I stopped and picked them up. And we're all sitting up in the truck. We're tootling down the road. They're thanking me up and down. Started talking, the nicest, really nice people. And then all of a sudden, out of his mouth comes how he's related. And I'm not making this up, Jeff. How he's related. He's a lost heir of all people, Henry Ford. Nothing to do with conspiracy, anything, but just Ford automobile. They screwed him out of his inheritance, and he's fighting him in court right now. And the woman next to him is, believing it. And then out of nowhere, he says, and in that duffel bag, and you got to remember the times. This was like the 80s when Reagan was developing Star Wars. And he goes, and in my duffel bag, I got a plan that'll blow Star Wars out of the water. And I'm like, okay, don't take your eye off the bag. Those sudden movements. But where I'm going with this is, it's funny. Obviously, they didn't kill me and bury me in the woods. But the point I'm trying to make is people like to, in their minds, create delusions of grandeur, of them knowing things that nobody else knows, having things that nobody else has. And it's not just poor homeless people. It's wealthy people. It's successful people. Henry Ford is the perfect example. And here you have Hartshorne, a popular man who could have put that story out to anyone, but chose the Watchtower to reveal his writings to.
And why? In these earlier newspapers before Watchtower, when he's publishing these ideas, when you try and fact check what he's saying, it doesn't quite match up either.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's similarly when you look at his later writings in Watchtower, and really the last magazines and papers that he was writing for was for Watchtower, because he died in the early 1920s. But he's basically pushing the same ideas that Rutherford was already believing, that Rutherford already believed back when he was in the Populist Party campaigning for Bryan. Papers that Rutherford saved and republished, forgeries that he republished later in Vindication, supporting or suggesting some of these ideas. But again, complete, utter forgeries, as we have shown.
And he found a home for where his work would be accepted
and appreciated.
Yeah.
As stated, this hazard circular is exactly what this article calls as a clumsy forgery. It isn't found in the London Financial Times. This circular and others like it are the sources of the idea that the Rothschilds funded the United States Civil War. Just like Henry Ford's anti-Semitic conspiracies, every time these Rothschild Civil War ones are retold, the story changes and grows. It evolves. None of it can be confirmed in any family correspondence, financial records, newspaper accounts, or any public documents whatsoever. Sometimes the story is told as these bankers funding the South because of the slave trade. Others suggest, no, they were on the side of the North with the Democrats, while others suggest that they played both sides of the war, yet without any documentation. The populist version of the Rothschild story also dealt more with the silver and gold standard, which Bryan and Judge Rutherford were promoting, while using one Rothschild forgery after another to try to prove their claims. Books written about the Rothschild family in the 19th century didn't contain any of these stories or links with the Civil War. Newspaper records also do not suggest the family involvement with the war until decades later. One of the earliest suggestions about the Rothschild involvement originated in the 1920s from a Russian book by Arthur Cherep-Spiridovich, The Secret World Government, or The Hidden Hand, which, oddly enough, was inspired by Henry Ford's International Jew. The Rothschild Civil War story had details about the British bringing troops into the United States from Mexico and dividing it between England and France. The next and differing version of this story was introduced by Father Coughlin, the father of hate radio. Are any of these stories true? I don't know, but I do know that many of them are based on forgeries, as the ones Rutherford and Father Coughlin use, as the ones we've shown here were proven forgeries, one after the other. Why is Rutherford basing his ideas and his doctrines on forgeries? Why is Watchtower basing their ideas off of forgeries? So what we're saying is that Rutherford's Rothschild conspiracies were a part of the foundation of the replacement theology he was building into Watchtower doctrine. As we've shown, he used these forged Rothschild letters in an attempt to bolster his anti-Semitic views that Jews were evil, that all Jews were rich, that all Jews were conspiring to dominate the world, and using that as the foundation for making Watchtower his spiritual Jews, to completely replace the Jews that he thought were evil because of the conspiracies that he believed all the way back to his Populist Party days. Now, as stated previously, both Rutherford and the Catholic priest Father Coughlin were kicked off the radio because of their hate speech. And when Coughlin and Rutherford's story intersect with each other, violence ensued.